You said write a motivational speech in the style of Gabor Maté titled as "Do This to an Empath and They Will Disappear from Your Life." Start with a bold and impressive introduction. End with a strong call to action that inspires the audience to take action. And don't mention him in the whole speech. ChatGPT said, "Do this to an empath and they will disappear from your life." There is a quiet kind of person in this world. One who feels deeply, listens carefully, and carries more emotional weight than they ever show. They don't demand attention. They don't shout their pain. They don't beg to be understood. They absorb. They accommodate. They endure. And because of that, many people misunderstand them. Some even take advantage of them, without realizing that one day, without drama, without warning, that empath will be gone. Empaths don't disappear because they are weak. They disappear because they have finally become strong. An empath enters relationships with openness. They read the emotional climate of a room instinctively. They sense discomfort before words are spoken. They offer patience when others offer excuses. Over time, this sensitivity becomes a silent responsibility. They become the emotional caretaker, the listener, the fixer, the one who adjusts again and again, so others don't have to. But here's the truth: most people miss. Empathy is not limitless. It is not self-erasing. And it is not a permission slip for neglect. An empath does not lose themselves overnight. It happens slowly, quietly, in ways that are almost invisible from the outside. It begins with small compromises that feel harmless at first. Staying silent instead of speaking up. Understanding someone else's behavior instead of questioning it. Offering patience where accountability should exist. Each time, the empath tells themselves it's love, it's maturity, it's kindness. And in isolation, each act looks noble. But over time, these small moments stack up, and something essential starts to fade. Empathy without boundaries is not compassion. It is self-erasure. When an empath gives endlessly without protection, their inner world becomes shaped around other people's comfort. They learn to read moods instantly, to anticipate needs before they're voiced, to soften their own truth so it doesn't disturb the emotional balance of the room. This ability often earns praise. They're called supportive, understanding, emotionally intelligent. But what rarely gets acknowledged is the cost. Because every time an empath suppresses their own needs to maintain connection, they teach themselves that their feelings are less important. At first, the body tolerates this imbalance. The empath pushes through discomfort because connection matters to them. They believe that if they just love better, explain more gently, wait a little longer, things will improve. But the nervous system keeps score. Unspoken resentment turns into tension. Emotional vigilance becomes exhaustion. The empath starts feeling tired in ways that rest doesn't fix. Not because they're weak, but because they're constantly on guard, constantly regulating emotions that are not even their own. Without boundaries, empathy becomes an open wound. People begin to take what is freely offered, often without malicious intent. They lean on the empath's availability. They offload their stress, their anger, their confusion, trusting that the empath will absorb it and still remain present. Over time, the relationship becomes unbalanced. One person expresses freely, the other contains endlessly. One is allowed to be human, the other is expected to be understanding at all times. This is where self-erasure quietly takes hold. The empath stops checking in with themselves. They stop asking what they feel, what they want, what they need. Their inner dialogue shifts from authenticity to accommodation. It's not that bad. They didn't mean it. I can handle it. These thoughts are not lies, they are survival strategies. They keep the connection alive at the expense of the self. But the psyche cannot sustain this forever. When boundaries are absent, the empath's identity begins to blur. They feel disconnected from their own desires. They struggle to access anger, even when anger would be appropriate. They confuse guilt with responsibility. They internalize the idea that setting limits makes them selfish or unloving. And so they continue giving, even as their inner world grows quieter, flatter, more distant. What makes this especially painful is that empaths often sense the imbalance long before they name it. Their body reacts before their mind catches up. A tight chest when a message arrives. A sense of dread before certain conversations. A feeling of relief when they're alone. These signals are not signs of failure in love. They are signs of a system that has been stretched too far. Boundaries are not walls. They are the structures that allow empathy to remain alive without becoming destructive. Without them, empathy turns inward and starts consuming the empath themselves. The very trait that makes them compassionate becomes the reason they feel empty. This is not because empathy is flawed, but because it was never meant to exist without self-protection. When an empath finally begins to understand this, it often comes with grief. Grief for how much they've given. Grief for how little they've asked for. Grief for the version of themselves that believed endurance was the same as love. This realization can feel destabilizing, because it challenges a deeply held identity. The belief that being good means being endlessly accommodating. But recognizing self-erasure is the first moment of return. It's the moment the empath sees that boundaries are not a betrayal of connection, but a requirement for it. That protecting their emotional space is not cruelty, but care. That love which demands self-abandonment is not love that nourishes. An empath does not need to become less sensitive to survive. They need to become more selective. They need to learn that saying no does not diminish their compassion. It preserves it. That honoring their limits does not make them cold. It makes their warmth sustainable. Without boundaries, empathy bleeds out. With boundaries, it becomes grounded, powerful, and real. Silence from an empath is rarely impulsive. It is not a tactic, not manipulation, not emotional withdrawal meant to punish. It is the final stage of a long internal process that began long before the words stopped. Before the quiet appeared on the surface, there were countless attempts to be heard, explanations offered gently, feelings expressed carefully, concerns framed in ways meant to avoid conflict. The empath speaks, not once but many times, adjusting their tone, choosing softer language, doubting themselves, hoping that clarity will finally create safety. When those attempts are met with dismissal, defensiveness, or indifference, something begins to shift internally. The empath learns that speaking costs more than it gives. Each time they open up and feel misunderstood, their nervous system registers danger. Not dramatic danger, but relational danger. The kind that teaches the body to brace, to anticipate invalidation, to stay alert even in moments that should feel secure. Over time, the empath begins to associate honesty with pain. This is where silence starts forming, not as absence, but as protection. The empath does not stop feeling, they stop exposing. They begin to conserve energy in subtle ways. They shorten responses. They stop bringing up difficult topics. They let things pass that once would have mattered deeply. From the outside, it may look like peace. Inside, it is emotional tragedy. The quiet phase is often misunderstood because it lacks intensity. There are no raised voices, no emotional outbursts, no dramatic confrontations. But silence carries weight. It signals that the empath has reached a point where engagement no longer feels safe or useful. They are no longer trying to change the relationship, because they no longer believe change is possible without self-harm. For an empath, emotional expression requires vulnerability. It requires trust that their inner world will be met with care. When that trust is broken repeatedly, the psyche adapts. The empath stops offering raw emotion, not because they don't care, but because caring has become too costly. Silence becomes a way to stay regulated in an environment that feels unpredictable or dismissive. This silence is not numbness, it is clarity without hope. The empath has already grieved the loss of understanding while still present. They have already accepted that their emotional needs are incompatible with the current dynamic. What remains is a calm that feels unsettling to others, because it is not the calm of resolution, it is the calm of detachment. In this stage, the empath is no longer negotiating, they are observing. They watch patterns repeat without reacting. They notice how little changes when they stop trying. They see the relationship more objectively, without the urgency to fix it. This distance is not cruelty, it is self-preservation. The most significant shift happens internally. The empath stops asking, "How can I explain this better?" and starts asking, "Why am I still explaining?" That question marks the turning point. It signals a return of self-respect, not loud, not confrontational, but steady and firm. The empath begins to recognize that being continually misunderstood is not a communication problem. It is a relational mismatch. Silence becomes the empath's final boundary, not because they want to shut the other person out, but because they are finally listening inward. Their body feels lighter when they stop engaging. Their mind feels clearer when they stop rehearsing conversations that never lead anywhere. This relief is not indifference. It is the absence of constant emotional strain. People often try to re-engage the empath at this point, sensing the distance but misunderstanding its meaning. They may ask what's wrong, why things feel different, why the empath seems withdrawn. But by the time silence arrives, the answers have already been given many times. The empath has learned that repeating themselves only deepens the wound. What makes this stage irreversible is not anger, but acceptance. The empath has accepted that their voice does not land here, that their emotional language is not spoken fluently in this space. And once that acceptance settles in, the nervous system begins preparing for release. Silence for an empath is not an empty space. It is full of decisions already made internally. It is the pause before departure, the stillness before movement. It is the moment when emotional energy is reclaimed, no longer offered to a dynamic that cannot hold it safely. The moment an empath chooses self-respect, something fundamental reorganizes within them. It is not a loud rebellion or a dramatic declaration. It is a quiet internal shift where the center of gravity moves from external validation to inner alignment. For a long time, the empath has measured their worth by how much they could give, how well they could understand others, how effectively they could keep relationships intact. Choosing self-respect disrupts that pattern at its root. This choice often begins with discomfort. Self-respect feels unfamiliar to someone who has been conditioned to prioritize harmony over truth. Saying no creates anxiety. Holding a boundary triggers guilt. Pulling back emotionally can feel like betrayal. Not of others, but of the empath's own self-image as someone who is endlessly available and understanding. Yet beneath that discomfort is something new and stabilizing, a sense of integrity. When an empath chooses self-respect, they stop negotiating with their own nervous system. They stop overriding exhaustion in the name of loyalty. They stop rationalizing behavior that feels wrong in their body. Instead of asking how much more they can tolerate, they begin asking what actually supports their well-being. This question alone changes everything. The transformation is not about becoming harder or more guarded. It is about becoming more honest. The empath starts noticing where they shrink, where they overextend, where they silence themselves to preserve connection. Awareness replaces automatic accommodation. They recognize that love which requires self-abandonment is not sustainable, no matter how familiar it feels. As self-respect strengthens, the empath's energy changes. They are less reactive, not because they care less, but because they are no longer operating from emotional depletion. They don't rush to fix other people's feelings. They allow discomfort to exist without immediately soothing it. This creates a new kind of presence, grounded, calm, and internally anchored. Relationships begin to shift in response to this change. Some connections deepen because they were waiting for authenticity all along. Others become strained because they were built on imbalance. The empath may be met with confusion or resistance when they stop overgiving. People who benefited from their lack of boundaries may interpret self-respect as distance, selfishness, or coldness. But self-respect is not withdrawal, it is realignment. The empath also begins to reclaim parts of themselves that were put aside. Desires resurface, creativity returns. Rest no longer feels like something to earn. There is more space internally, less noise from unspoken resentment. This spaciousness allows the empath to feel joy without guilt and anger without shame. Emotions become signals rather than threats. Choosing self-respect also reshapes how the empath experiences empathy itself. They no longer merge with other people's pain. They can feel compassion without absorbing suffering. This distinction is crucial. It allows empathy to be a bridge rather than a burden. The empath can remain open without becoming overwhelmed, present without becoming depleted. There is also a grief that accompanies this transformation. Grief for relationships that cannot come along. Grief for years spent believing that love meant endurance. Grief for the younger self who did not know they were allowed to take up space. This grief is not a setback. It is a release. It clears the emotional residue of self-betrayal. As self-respect becomes embodied rather than conceptual, the empath's choices become simpler. Not easier, but clearer. They trust their internal signals. They walk away sooner when something feels wrong. They no longer wait for proof that their pain is valid. They understand that respect is not something to be argued into existence. This transformation does not make the empath superior or detached. It makes them whole. They stop fragmenting themselves to fit into spaces that cannot hold their depth. They stop mistaking intensity for intimacy. They choose environments where their sensitivity is not merely tolerated but valued. The most profound shift is internal. The empath no longer feels the need to disappear to protect themselves. They no longer oscillate between overexposure and withdrawal. Self-respect provides a stable center from which connection can occur without collapse. From this place, empathy becomes a choice rather than a compulsion, a strength rather than a survival strategy.